Good afternoon and welcome to Remaking the Economy, Who Will Profit? I'm Steve Dubb, I'm the Senior Editor at Nonprofit Quarterly, and this webinar is the third in a series, 7-session series about how civil society can participate in making the U.S. economy more democratic. Over the next few months, we'll have sessions on building policy agendas, community finance, and more. You'll join us for those as well. And we're fortunate today to be joined by several guests, including Mike Curtin, who's CEO of DC Central Kitchen in Washington, D.C., Melissa Hoover, Executive Director of the Democracy at Work Institute, based in California, but that operates nationally, and Tomas Duran, CEO of Concern Capital in Los Angeles, California. We'll also be showing a video interview with Ed Whitfield, who's co-managing director of the Fund for Democratic Communities based in Greensboro, North Carolina. A few notes before we get started. First, we're very excited to take all of your questions, and there is a question box, and we'll be leaving a fair amount of time at the end of the webinar to allow panelists to answer those questions. So please do give us your questions, and we'll try to follow up with the ones we aren't able to answer as well afterward. Please enter any questions you have into the question mark box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll share them with the panelists when we get to that part of the discussion. Second, we will be sharing the slides and recording with everyone via email after the webinar, so you don't have to ask if in the chat box if you'll be getting the slides and recording. You will. And we will also post them on the MPQ webpage within the next few days, so please don't worry about that. Finally, we are very happy to offer this webinar free of charge to all of our community, but of course it's not free for Nonprofit Quarterly to put on these webinars. So if you can, please consider donating and supporting NBQ so that we can continue to offer this programming and exciting topics with all of you. So thanks for being here today. And I'll move into my presentation now. Next slide, please. So we'll start with, one of the themes of this, is looking, so in this theme, we're talking about building a more democratic economy. If you look at the current statistics, and these come from the Survey of Consumer Finance of the Federal Reserve, you'll see that the distribution of stock ownership is highly unequal. So the top 1% have 40% of all stock. The bottom 90% only have 17%. And for those of you who are on our land webinars, you'll recall that that this is even more unequal than it is. Business ownership is even more unequal than land ownership. Next slide, please. And if stock ownership is unequal, private business ownership is even more unequal. So nearly 2/3 of all business in the United States, that's private equity, is owned by 1% of the population. By contrast, the bottom 90% have less than 6% of business assets. Next slide. And so, what can we do about that? That's the theme of this webinar, is really how do we build a democratic economy that changes those kind of numbers. And we're going to focus in this webinar on 3 specific strategies, one of which is nonprofits that own business, which is sometimes referred to as social enterprise, cooperatives, especially focused on worker cooperatives, and employee stock ownership plan companies, and another form of worker ownership. There are other community business strategies that are also worth mentioning. Public ownership, so that includes things like the U.S. Post Office, but also municipally owned utility companies. So there's a lot of public ownership actually in the United States, even though we don't always acknowledge it. There's also ownership that's not owned by government, but sort of a common public resource. Things like open source software, for example, would fit that category. And there's also community corporations. So Green Bay Packers is a good example of a institution that's actually owned by residents of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And so there's a number of different ways to operate businesses where profits and ownership are widely shared. And if we want to change those numbers that were provided in those first two slides, these are all really important strategies for achieving that. Next slide. So this is the third in a series. Just want to point out that coming up next will be community capital finance, followed by leveraging hospitals and universities, or what are known as EDs and MEDs, and building policy, and then we'll end with looking at this, how to think about systemic change as a whole. So with that, I think next slide. And again, just to review, these are some of the objectives of the series: trying to clarify principles, develop a toolkit, understand how we're creating ecosystems. So it's not about one specific intervention, but the interrelation of the parts. Look at ways to decolonize wealth and foster racial equity, highlight points of leverage that can help change the numbers that were highlighted at the beginning, foster shifts in practice and thinking, and balance the need to meet the needs of the people we're serving in the short term with having a long-term vision that can lead to transformative change. So that's the tall order of this series and what we're trying to address. And with that, I want to shift shortly to an interview. I did want to make one note on the interview before we begin. So there's a co-op that's referred to there, the Renaissance Cooperative. It's a food co-op that Ed Whitfield will talk about. And I did want to acknowledge that they announced actually today, as it turns out, that co-op is being shut down. In the interview, Ed talks about some of the problems that ultimately, I guess, led to that shutdown. So with that, let's shift to the interview and with Ed Whitfield, co-managing director of Fund for Democratic Communities. Good afternoon. My name is Steve Dubb. I'm senior editor at Nonprofit Quarterly, and I'm here with Ed Whitfield, the co-founder and co-managing director of the Fund for Democratic Communities. And Ed, to begin this conversation, I wanted to ask you, why should nonprofits care about promoting community ownership of business?
Ownership makes a tremendous amount of difference, given that the owners of businesses typically have control over the access of people to the product of the business. They have control over the working conditions in the business. They have control over the manufacturing techniques. Ownership conveys a lot of power in terms of the structure of businesses, and marginalized communities, other communities, need to be able to own businesses within those communities so that they can operate those businesses in a way that benefits the community rather than operating them simply to make profit, often at the expense of both people and the planet.
Great. Could you talk about the work of the Fund for Democratic Communities and why you focused your grant making on promoting economic democracy as a way to address racial and economic inequality?
First of all, we think that it's really important that much of what people talk about when they talk about social justice work has an economic component: housing, jobs, taking care of food, taking care of themselves. And so that's when we started moving in the direction of thinking that a democratic economy would in fact be a cooperative economy where ownership itself is shared, because again, ownership confers so many privileges to the owner. And a very, very concentrated form of ownership that characterizes the current economy. It's clearly the main problem in what's wrong with that economy. That concentrated ownership does not allow for the vast majority of the people to have control over the means of life. And a lot of people talk about the means of production, and that's kind of an abstract sounding 19th century phrase. But if you think of it, this is the means of life, that either you have access to land that you can grow food on and eat, either you have access to the machinery that allows you to make the clothing, the houses, the tools that you need. If you don't have access to those things, then the very means of staying alive in an advanced economy are taken away from you. And that's wrong. That is utterly wrong. We have to do better than that. We have to construct a world in which the access to what people need in order to stay alive and to thrive and prosper, to meet their needs and elevate the quality of life in their communities, where the access of that is democratically allocated, democratically managed in such a way that it's available for all of us to be the fully productive humans that we can be.
Great. Thanks, Ed. Just quickly, if you could talk a little bit about, you guys made a decision when you set up the fund you could have set it up as a permanent endowment, and instead you decided that you wanted to spend all the assets, I think, in a 10-year period. You can correct me if I'm off on that. What was behind that decision?
Well, we got started all together in 2007. By 2010, we were having a strategic planning meeting, and the question came up between Marnie Thompson, who's the other co-founder and co-managing director of the Fund for Democratic Communities. It's like, do we want to exist in perpetuity, or do we want to live out a more limited life and make more of our assets available to communities more quickly? And it only took us a few minutes, quite frankly, to decide that, forever and ever is a really, really long time, and nothing is certain that long, and the needs are immediate. In 2010, we decided, let's do a 10-year run. Let's operate until the end of 2020, and in the course of that time, make sure we have given away all of our assets, not so that we're just not around any longer, and we ourselves don't have to be bothered making the decisions to go along with philanthropy, but rather so that those resources can more quickly find their way into the hands of the people who can use them. And if they're able to use them again in a regenerative way, that they be the ones who live within community in perpetuity using these resources.
Great, thanks, Ed. I know a phrase that you've used often and when you've given talks at conferences and so forth is RAD. And could you talk about what that stands for and how that guides your philosophy?
I'd love to. It's connected with how we understand power and the relationship between power and rights. A lot of people come from rights frameworks where they're asserting we have a right to this, a right to that. People talk either about civil rights or they talk about human rights. But the rights discourse is connected with making an appeal to people who have overwhelming power, that they should utilize that power in such a way to meet your needs. So the real issue is, how do we have the power to do the things we need to do? So I decided to think about this in terms of the three relationships we have to power. On the one hand, overwhelming power can crush you, and indeed it will unless you resist it. So part of our work is resistance, to keep from being destroyed. Power can be used to support us if it's being used in some benevolent kind of way, but only if we advise it of how it can help us to meet our needs. We have to direct that power. So that's why we do advocacy work. But on the other hand, that's both of those forms of power are power that are outside of us, that we don't control, and we are therefore either resisting to keep it from crushing us, or we're advocating to so it can help us. But in the final analysis, we're capable of being power, given that we are the ones, we the people are the producers of the value in the society. And if we can be power, we can do for ourselves. And that ultimately our full humanity lies in our ability to do things for ourselves, rather than appealing to someone else who has the power over us to do those things for us. And so I call that the D, is do for ourselves. And so resistance, advocacy, and do for ourselves, each one of those plays a component part. But I think the resistance work we do is so that we can stay alive in order to do things for ourselves. I think that the advocacy work that we do is so that we can advocate that existing power puts resources more closely aligned to our access so that we can use it to do things for ourselves. And that our full humanity lies in being the productive people that we are capable of being, and producing the food, clothing, shelter, the meaning in our lives, and defending what we have produced to be, again, this is what our full humanity consists of.
Great, thanks, Ed. I thought ask you about a couple of the signature projects you guys have been involved in, and one of those is certainly the Renaissance Community Cooperative in Greensboro, where you guys are based in North Carolina. Talk a little bit about the project and what have you learned in doing this economic democracy work?
We learned that a lot of things are a lot harder than they seem. The Renaissance Community Cooperative grocery store developed in a community that had been a food desert since 1998. We ended up running into a huge amount of opposition and obstacles from the existing food co-op world, who were quick to tell us that it wasn't going to work, that neighborhoods like that were too black, too poor, and too uneducated to have a co-op. And it baffled me when I saw that they actually wrote that down. They described it as a community having weak demographics. And we had to spend a couple of years fighting in the food co-op world around the exact definition of what they meant by weak demographics. And, there were some people who were embarrassed for a while, and they changed that. I'm pleased to say that a lot of people who were saying that at one time no longer say that, and there's a lot more help available for startup food cooperatives, and I think that that's a good thing. But it's challenging. It's very, very difficult to build a successful store in a competitive environment.
Great, thanks. We'll talk about the Southern Reparation Loan Fund, which is presumably one of those tools you're trying to develop to even the odds a little bit.
Right. We're trying to develop a democratic lending network. The Southern Reparations Loan Fund is a regional structure in the South that right now is made up of 5 loan funds. One here in Greensboro, North Carolina, that is servicing our loan to the Renaissance Community Cooperative grocery store. There is also a loan fund in Charleston, West Virginia. There's a new loan fund developing in Lexington, Kentucky. There's a new loan fund developing in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And there's one that we're really excited about in Asheville, North Carolina, that just completed a loan to an immigrant community of mixed status that was able to purchase a mobile home park to stabilize their rent.
Great. So, Ed, I want to bring this interview sort of to a close, but before I do, one last question for our audience. Is there anything that you would advise them to think about, or would you'd like to add to this conversation?
One thing is that I think that collaborative, collective ownership is very, very important, but it requires that we build democracy. The building of democracy, the organizing work is a huge and key component. At the same time, there's some technical skills that are connected with business development skills that people need to learn, but they need to learn those skills in the context of how they can be used in those communities that have been left out. Not for the purpose of necessarily including them in the large mainstream economy, but rather in helping those communities, again, meet their needs and elevate the quality of life inside the community. Because at some point, I believe the larger economy is going to reach even more and more crises, like some of the ones we've already witnessed, that will go deeper and deeper. And some folks need to be looking around and say, well, if this doesn't work, what does work? And I want us to have built the examples that people can look to and say, this is what works. So let's build this thing. And again, let's center meeting our needs and elevating the quality of life rather than centering making ever increasing amounts of profit that ultimately require us to exploit the labor of people, where we take and accumulate the entire value that people create with their productive potential.
Okay, Ed, thanks so much for your time, for participating in this interview, and we'll return to the webinar.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, so we'll now move on, and our first presenter is Mike Curtin from DC Central Kitchen.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate that. If you do hear a little background noise, I'm in the middle of the kitchen right now, so hopefully they'll be quiet and let us take care of our business. So if we want to hit that first slide. Okay, so this is a picture from our 100th graduation of our 100th culinary job training class. What DC Central Kitchen started out as was an organization that rescued food that was going to go to waste and turned that into healthy meals to shelters, transitional homes, halfway houses. But most importantly, while we were doing that, we used that food as a tool to train men and women who face significant barriers to employment, like incarceration, addiction, abuse, trauma, homelessness, chronic unemployment, to get jobs in the hospitality business. And so the kitchen really started out more as a classic nonprofit and moved into social enterprise, which is the first bucket of community business that Steve mentioned in his introduction, and that's what I'm going to be addressing today. So we really had the advantage of starting out and working as a social service, traditional nonprofit, and moving into social enterprise as an outgrowth of our culinary job training program. And the reason that we have this photo here is on the far left there is our founder, Robert Egger. Many of you may have encountered him over the years. Next to him is Miss Dorothy. She's one of our first graduates that we hired. And that was one of the roles of this social enterprise was to create some jobs for graduates, myself, and then Marianne Ali, who was our longtime culinary job training director, who passed a couple of years ago. But when we started this social enterprise in the mid-90s, social enterprise really wasn't a big thing, and we probably wouldn't have been having a webinar like this about, or any seminar about this, about social enterprise. But we felt that we had a business niche that we could tap into, catering events for other nonprofits. But we didn't really see it as a money-making venture or a significant money-making venture, certainly not that what it has become, almost over 60% of our revenue, or even a huge job creator, but just a way to challenge people's ideas about what was possible and what graduates in our program could do. And so it really was this idea of putting people in a place where they would be forced to think differently, what we call a calculated epiphany, or luring people into fancy events and then letting them know, as the Trojan horse of DC Central Kitchen, that their meal was being prepared, had been prepared by, as we often said, the addicts and felons of DC Central Kitchen. So it was all about this showmanship and good business, which takes us to the next slide. The kitchen has always been based on this idea that what we do is not charity. It's not extra. It's not just nice. It's just something that's good to do. It is smart to do. It is good business. It's an investment in the community. Before, actually, people were using the word social entrepreneur. Robert coined this term righteous entrepreneur, and that's what he liked to refer to himself as. And we came up with, a few years ago, we felt that if we were going to use this term righteous entrepreneur, and self-righteously call ourselves that, we should define it. So we came up with 8 rules. And the first rule, and all 8 are going to be in a handout that Steve and his team will be distributing with the slides. But the first rule is it's okay to be a little antisocial in service of your mission. And this is a much longer story, but the quick version of this is that, and this is how we really moved in significantly into social enterprise, is that we were having a dispute with the city, District of Columbia, about who would pay for the shelter meals that ultimately we had been providing for free for 17 years in all of their shelters. We worked for a year to get them to agree to pay a small piece of that cost. We got to that place, and we were just waiting for a contract to be written up, and that kept being postponed and postponed and postponed. And we really felt that if the work that we did was respected, if the work that we did was treated as business, as real, we wouldn't have been forced to wait another 3 months to get this contract. So we went on strike. That's the antisocial piece. We said we are not going to deliver food to these shelters until this contract is signed and we start getting paid for the work that we're doing. So we can pay the men and women that are doing this. We can pay our vendors, and we can earn a fair wage for the money for the work that we've done, and to really try to twist people's minds about what the business, the social business that nonprofits were in. And to put an emphasis on this, Robert and I also decided that while we were on strike, we weren't going to eat either. So this led to 8 days. That's a much longer story, but ultimately we got what we wanted. We started having a cash flow, a revenue flow that we had never seen before, which takes us to our next slide. And we started buying food, and instead of relying so heavily on donated food. And one of the things we quickly realized, though, when we were buying food, is that we were buying food from places that were not helping our local economy. So we started buying directly from local farms, and we started buying most particularly product that was seconds, that was things were too skinny, too fat, didn't fit in the right box, didn't fit in the right truck. So we could actually start through our social business that was earning money to support our kitchen and creating jobs for our graduates. We were also supporting rural economies from southern Pennsylvania to the Shenandoah Valley. And so things were moving along quite well until the recession of 2008 hit. And when many nonprofits started to panic, cut services, lay people off, what we felt that we needed to do was actually expand services, do more meals, do more training, hire more people, but we had to do it in a way that would pay for itself. So we looked to social enterprise, and we said, but we need a business that's going to be sustainable, that's going to be, we can plan for the long term, we can take to scale. And where we went to was school food. And we invested heavily in that in 2008 in starting that program. In 2010, mostly because of the work of Mrs. Obama coming in and really shining a light on organizations like DC Central Kitchen that were working in that field. school districts upgraded their food. We were a beneficiary of that. DC put out an RFP. We responded to that and started our first contract back in 2010 with DC Public Schools. It is for $2 million. It's now grown to 6.5. And what we've seen on the next slide is that as we have grown our social enterprise business, the philanthropic support for DC Central Kitchen has followed along beautifully. So what we now can really pitch or talk about DC Central Kitchen as a business that does create a social return on investment, that is a sustainable investment, that is worthy of investment, financial investment in the work that we do in the community. And on the last slide, we can actually point now to that social return on investment and go and roll it all the way for the big reveal on it. Last year, the total return on investment that we put, or the social return on investment that we put into this community was $71 million. That, as you can see, is made up of a number of different things: reducing recidivism, investing in local food systems, supporting childhood health, reducing food insecurity, reducing recidivism, again, expanding our tax base. And that also, this is a fully supportive number that Steve will also distribute something to you. But the point here ultimately is that we have gone from a social service nonprofit that saw an opportunity to create more jobs, to expand our mission through our business. But it had to be a smart business, it had to be a good business, and it had to be one that ultimately could stand on its own and return a significant investment to our community. I'll turn it back to Steve.
All right, thanks, Mike, and I will then introduce Melissa Hoover to talk about the work of Democracy at Work Institute.
Great, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Mike. So the Democracy at Work Institute exists we were founded about 5 years ago to expand the worker cooperative model to communities that are locked out of access to business ownership and good jobs. And I'm going to less tell our story and more sort of talk about the broader trends happening in the worker ownership and worker cooperative world. So, building on, Mike made an amazing case for the power of business ownership. And I'm going to move us to shared ownership. So why share ownership of businesses as opposed to, or in addition to individual entrepreneurship? So, cooperatives have always responded to conditions and problems in communities. They're a very practical form that originates out of people solving their own problems. So we look at this sort of iceberg of problems. In the problem iceberg, the formal economy is that top part, right? This is what we think of when we think about people in jobs and building wealth, is working in market-based businesses in a capitalist firm and advocating within that framework. The reality is that a vast majority of people who work in this country aren't actually captured within that employment relationship. They're contingent workers, they are self-employed, they're moonlighting, they're operating outside of the market. And so I think, when we look at these solutions, cooperative solutions, a large part of worker cooperatives are addressing the part below the water there in the iceberg. So the top really is wealth consolidation and inequality as a result of that wage labor market. But the bottom really speaks to the erosion of a lot of the social safety net. Systems of entry into the economy have fallen apart for poor and working class people. So workforce development system isn't serving them, unions aren't serving them, small business credit has eroded, immigration policy isn't working, the social safety net is failing, there's a growth of third-party contractors and aging business owners, and sort of on and on, we see that these problems are being addressed by worker cooperatives. So at the very bottom there of the pyramid, we see that shared ownership of business just basically lowers barriers to entry for people into a market, into not necessarily an employment relationship, but into a way to make money and own a business asset. And the effect of that is stability. That's the very first effect. We focus a lot on mobility when we talk about business ownership, but in reality, you have to be stable before you can be mobile. And then I think at the top, when we're talking about the formal economy and larger businesses and employment relationships, one of the values of shared ownership, or sort of the the value of shared ownership in this discussion is that it gives us a framework for talking about the social purpose of business. It's a narrative, there's a story there. Even within market-based activity, we can articulate a different way of doing business, and that's for worker and community benefit. We could go to the next slide. There's a sort of a common perception that worker cooperatives or cooperatives more generally might be sort of utopian or a way for people to exit the economy and create their own alternatives. But what we're finding is that in the last 20 years, worker cooperatives are being used as a tool for people locked out of opportunities to enter the economy, not to exit it. So they're entering it, but on their own terms. The graphs are a little small over there, but the major point I want to hit is up in the top right corner. 75% of people in worker cooperatives right now are women or non-binary people. And the plurality of worker owners are Latino at this moment in time. So there's a real sea change happening demographically. And I think it's not a coincidence that women and people of color are concentrated within the bottom part of that sort of problem iceberg in terms of access to good jobs and business ownership. I'll just point out there that worker cooperatives at the bottom tend to have a very equitable pay ratio. They are offering sort of living wage, above minimum wage, entry-level wages, and distributing patronage at a substantial amount. Patronage is the profit sharing within a cooperative. The vast majority of co-ops are started as startups, but there's a substantial percentage that are also and increasingly being created by converting existing businesses to shared ownership. So let's move to the next slide. I want to share some stories just to give a little bit of depth and dimension to what could be a really abstract understanding of shared ownership of business. So up there in the top right corner, the Center for Family Life is a social service agency in New York City that has developed the Si Se Puede worker co-op. The problem that's addressing is unstable and unsafe conditions for domestic workers, for house cleaners. Their method is for the nonprofit entity, the agency, to essentially incubate a business that pulls together independent contractors into a stabilizing form, a shared business that they can then use to enter the market and offer their services and negotiate with clients. I think the game changer with that model is franchising it, where we as Democracy at Work Institute are focused on scale and equity. So we're always interested in what's a game-changing intervention here that takes it beyond a micro enterprise or a small business into an entity that has, can affect meaningful change in the economy. And speaking of which, the top left corner is Cooperative Home Care Associates. The home care agency in New York, it's the largest worker cooperative in the country at just over 2,000 workers. Its method and model is one large agency intended to change industry standards and connected to the workforce development system with a very strong training component and leadership development. The game changer there is that it's affiliated to a union, SEIU 1199, and has a three-part model where there's a worker cooperative business, a nonprofit training entity, and then a market-facing managed care agency that creates a market for the home care co-op. The bottom left corner, Yard and a Half Landscaping, is a landscaping company that is actually a conversion from a single owner business to shared ownership. Within the last 5 years, the landscapers at Yard and a Half and the landscape designers, everyone on staff, bought out the business from a retiring owner. The game changer here is that this is an extremely entrepreneurial workforce. They have varying skills and experience, but they deeply invested time and energy into buying this business from its owner. They've grown their sales and increased their staffing since the conversion, and are running the business as a cooperative now, and all sharing the profits from that. And then the bottom right corner is a new model, California Harvesters. This is a farm labor co-op in the Central Valley of California. It's structured as an employee trust. It has an anchor client that it serves. And the game changer there is that anchor client and the partners that have gone in to create this sort of extremely new form, enlarged by worker cooperative standards, 800 workers at last count, with a deep investment in organizing third-party contracted labor, not through a union, but through a worker-owned entity that can negotiate for better wages and conditions. So next slide sort of captures some of these stories into some trends that are happening in the field. There's an increasing interest in scale-oriented models. How do we actually take these businesses and aggregate their market power, their people power, to change industries and create better conditions for the businesses themselves and for their worker owners? What kind of partnerships are happening there that sort of fortify and scale? Another trend is connection to local economic development. We're seeing a ton of interest from local economic developers in cities across the country, large to small, in preserving and retaining their existing businesses by helping them convert to worker ownership, in stabilizing commercial corridors through shared ownership of business, and creating more resilient communities. This was the year that worker ownership really broke onto the federal policy scene. There is a bill that passed this year, the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, that directs the SBA to recognize, fund, and support employee-owned businesses through their small business development networks. And we're also beginning to see city funding and policy move in the direction of worker ownership. And finally, the field is getting savvier about capital. So there are increasing capital tools available to worker-owned businesses, which is especially critical for people who don't have a lot to invest in their business initially. So helping find supports for both transitioning and starting businesses. Next slide, and then we'll wrap up. So the role of nonprofit organizations in all of this, I think, is both really promising and can be a little sticky. So far, we've seen everything from a very low-touch approach, sort of helping and encouraging people who are already going to start a cooperative or already going to start a business to structure it as a cooperative. That has the broad impact of a lot of micro-enterprises, all the way up to the other end, a really high-touch model where the nonprofit organization actually becomes the entrepreneur, invests the capital, takes the risks, builds and recruits the members, and develops a model that's intended to have a deep impact, to scale and to intervene in a place or a market. So if we can do the next pieces of this slide. This question of whether nonprofits should do direct business development, particularly cooperative development, is a thorny one. I'd like to suggest that if you have the skills and capacity, that's totally the right direction to go. And there may be some other ways that you as a nonprofit organization can engage with this. So if you could do the next piece. Some other possibilities for the roles for nonprofits, if you have competency in workforce development and training, connect to a business development partner. Nonprofits can also play a role in making markets for existing or startup worker cooperatives, connecting them to anchor clients or others, social purpose clients. Nonprofits can play an advocacy and lobbying role. And in some cases, we've seen nonprofits acting as like a general contractor or a connector of all the pieces necessary to either start or convert a business to employee ownership. So there's I think it's sort of an expansive possibility there for the role of a nonprofit in helping shared ownership businesses get started. I'm going to wrap up there. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. And again, I sent a chat message to this effect, but I encourage, please put your questions in the question box. And next up, and last but not least, is Tomas Duran from Concerned Capital.
Hi, good. Hello, everybody. I'm gonna build on what Melissa was saying a little bit earlier and talk about our experience in helping nonprofits create social enterprises that are geared toward keeping wealth within the community and also growing unrestricted income for the actual nonprofit. Concerned Capital is a private for-profit social benefit corporation, and what we do is basically work to create and save jobs in low-income and underserved communities. We've been doing this kind of work for about 12, 15 years unofficially and about 8 years officially. The reason that we get involved in and what we do specifically here in Southern California and nationally is because we want to address we want to have a private entity that addresses economic development, and is done in a way that can be shared with other people in other places. So everything that we do is geared toward supporting people who have similar missions in other parts of the country. I just want to take a real quick second and go off script from the slide a little bit and talk about, the slides basically talk about saving jobs. But the key to that is having a location-based strategy that is responsive to what your community wants and needs. For Southern California here, we have an enormous concentration of manufacturing, and they tend to be smaller mom and pop shops that have been around for decades. So most of our work in Southern California focuses on manufacturing and growing those businesses because they have a low barrier to entry. Oftentimes they're very stable and create income generating opportunities for people in the low-income communities that surround the manufacturing centers. The other thing we do is work with nonprofits to create social enterprises that are going to allow them to continue to meet the needs that they've identified. And in a few minutes, I'll give you some examples of those kind of things that we've done. But one of the reasons we work with nonprofits is because, they have standing in the community. They know what the needs are. They can tell you what the context is, who are the players, who are the people, who are the stakeholders, where the challenges are. And oftentimes you're funded to address those things and find ways to alleviate those challenges. So we like to support that effort and bring the business acumen that we have in terms of not only business operation, but also accessing capital to help those businesses grow to support the nonprofits in that space. And essentially, it's all about generating wealth and keeping that wealth locally in the local community. So let's go to the next slide. Gentrification is a huge issue for us, especially here in Los Angeles. And most of the major urban areas across the country, actually for most of the country, where forces that are outside of the control of the local community can come in and start changing the makeup of that local community. Well, the best way that we feel to push back against that is by creating local living economies that are responsive to the local needs. And that requires local ownership. So we want to promote and help local entrepreneurs who are interested in doing those things. We believe that nonprofits play a valuable role in that space, not only because they're often located there, but they're operating businesses. You already have the acumen to have payroll, to have insurance, to have benefits, to do administrative things. While you may not be filing taxes, you prepare for audits, and you do all number of different things, and you have a whole number of different scope of services you do internally that make you pretty similar to the businesses that are operating there. And so we believe there's a lot of opportunities for those two entities to work together and grow. So let's go to the next slide. So some quick examples of where we applied this. We had a local community development. I'm sorry, I don't have authorizations to share the client information, so I can only talk about things in generalities. But we have a local community development nonprofit that's been doing work in Los Angeles for over 25 years in one of our urban core areas. And they had a number of board members who had access to facilities that were generating surplus. And that surplus could have been sold. It could be sold as a way to create unrestricted income for that nonprofit. Now, this particular nonprofit was concerned about creating that income because they wanted to find ways to incentivize their key staff members to continue to stay with the nonprofit. They had an extensive and really good development program within the organization, but they kept losing their staff members to larger corporations or larger jobs because at some point they felt they needed to move beyond. So what we were able to help them do is take a look around and see what opportunities they had in that space. And we found that their service area was bordered by a very affluent area, and the people they were providing services to were very, very impoverished. And so we created a way to help them actually create a resale store where they solicited donations, solicited opportunities, and then they turned around and sold those and used the proceeds to create income for their nonprofit. And the people who had been supported the nonprofit for quite a long time were excited to have another way to continue supporting them and their mission there. The next example I wanted to cover is a faith-based organization that was concerned about its dwindling membership and wanted to, but had a long history in the area. And what they had noticed is that a lot of their members were having children, and their children were they didn't have access to childcare, which was severely impacting their members' ability to get training or to go back to work or to go back to school. And it was affecting the quality of life. And so people ended up leaving the area where this nonprofit was located. And so they wanted to look into finding ways to not only incentivize the retention of their members, but also provide a service to the community that was really needed. And so we helped them buy an existing daycare. Then we helped them improve the facility and increase the number of seats they were able to have there. And what that has done is become an incentive for the members and the local members of this particular faith-based community to start coming back and re-engaging with this organization for the services and events they do beyond the daycare. But it's the little hook that keeping this members and increasing their membership for this membership organization, as well as providing income and the service for them. And then last, this is a nonprofit, this is a social enterprise that we're actually working on right now with a community development entity that's been in South LA for close to 26, 27 years. And the issue that they're focused on right now is access to food, healthy food, and addressing the challenges of operating in a food desert. So what we've done is help them put together a strategy to build an ecosystem that supports restaurants and growing operation, distribution information, and a grocery store that's going to pull together and address that important need, but also help them offer a shared services because they already have things like the administration and the back office support that the tenants will be able to use because they're co-located. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to go through this pretty quick because I want to move over to the next part of our presentation. I want to bring this up because I think there's a great opportunity in what we see happening across the country with the coming wave of retiring baby boomers and other people who want to start moving on, or entrepreneurs that are ready to retire or move on from that business. There's going to be an opportunity for a lot of local social enterprise and for nonprofits particularly to get involved to keep businesses and jobs in their communities. Unfortunately, right now, 75% of business owners don't have an exit strategy. They don't have a plan for what they're going to do, where they're going to go, or how they're going to move on. In our case, in Southern California, with manufacturing, a lot of their employees have been there with them for decades. And so there's a sense of loyalty and fealty to them. And so they don't want to just close shop, but they don't have an exit opportunity. So we're finding a lot of opportunities to help transition those businesses from the retiring owners to the workers. There's wonderful opportunities for the nonprofits that are ready and want to engage in that, either as an intermediary or as a buyer for that to keep those jobs local. This kind of strategy can work in retail and commercial and manufacturing. It really just depends on the capacity of the nonprofit and the local market and what you want to see work. I do want to add a word of caution that it's not a panacea. It won't save a business that's no longer viable. You know, if you have a local carrier pigeon business, you know, that's not the market anymore, and that business can't be saved by doing this kind of transition. But it is a very interesting opportunity for people who are vested in the local community. So let's go to the last slide and I'll wrap up. We see, you know, if you want to take a very specific role in this social enterprise, we don't encourage our clients to start up businesses. Rather, we encourage our clients to take over an existing business. The success rate for existing business is way higher than it is for a startup business. And so, and there's a number of ways that nonprofit can support that, either because you're already managing employees, you're already raising capital and deploying capital, you already have administrative services, and you may be in a position where you want to incubate a business while it's being prepared for the employees to organize and take it over themselves. We actually have a program that we're developing called the two-step program that is geared just for nonprofits to help them not only identify and underwrite a operating business, but create a strategy for them to incubate and help that business grow for a few years until the employees are ready to buy it themselves, and then nonprofit goes on to whatever's next. So in the interest of time, I'm going to cut it off there, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the question and answer. Thank you.
Okay, and let's see. Hopefully, we can get everyone else on camera here. We'll start. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then for the group, and then go to the questions from the audience. And there've been some pretty good questions that come up, and please keep them coming. So I'll just start with a general question. I don't know, maybe I'll start with Mike on this one, but there are good reasons for nonprofits to get involved in business development, and there are bad reasons for nonprofits to get involved in business development. So, what is the right motivation for nonprofits to do business development?
Well, I think the first thing you have to think about, and it's the first question all nonprofits should always ask when they're starting something new or different or expanding, is does this fit our mission? Is this what we are intended to do? Is this what we set out to do? And are we going to accomplish what we want to do? We also have to remember, especially if we're starting a business, that a business for business sake doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work and it's going to be something successful. The quick story, and then I'll kick it over, Steve, is that I before joining DC Central Kitchen, I was in the restaurant business, and I owned and operated my own restaurant for almost 5 years. And I say now that was my first experience in the nonprofit sector, which was owning my own restaurant. And so those rules hold true for the nonprofit sector as well. So you have to have both the social and the enterprise piece, and they both have to work. And so I'd say that. And then the last piece I would want to say is that I don't think, at least in the food world, we'll talk about that one should never think that starting a social enterprise is going to eliminate the need for doing everything else that you're already doing, or certainly the philanthropic funding. And as I showed in the slides there, the philanthropy has really benefited from or pulled along, the enterprise has pulled the philanthropy along. But we want to be both. We are a community-based organization, social enterprise, for purpose company. We don't want to become that which we are trying to clean up after, but we need to make sure that we're going to be able to sustain ourselves in a way that's going to be productive and accomplish our mission.
Great, thanks. Melissa, you want to jump in at all?
I guess I would say, the world of worker co-op development is changing a little bit. I used to tell people, don't get into this if you think that you're going to make money off of your worker co-op, because actually the funds are going to flow the other way, at least for a while. But I think, and that's still true to some extent. I think it's important with cooperatives to really understand that the business is meant to benefit the members. So that's its first purpose. It's not meant to benefit an outside entity, even an incubating nonprofit. So if you're developing a sort of a strict cooperative, at some point when it spins off, there may be an equity position for the incubating nonprofit. I think there are ways to have a revenue stream, and to Tomas's point, converting a going concern is going to generate that a lot more reliably than a startup. But I think that this might speak a little bit to the difference between a cooperatively owned business and a sort of a regular social enterprise.
Yeah.
I would, Steve, jump in. I would just add that, that's why it's really important for you to understand what your local needs are. If you're in an area that doesn't have a restaurant or doesn't have any access to kind of food, but you have a lot of local entrepreneurs who are good at what they do, that might be something that's viable. But, you have to really consider, what's the business case for what you want to do. And the only other thing I would add is that, we like to do the conversions because oftentimes the businesses that we're converting have managers that are excellent at what they do. They're been doing it for a long time. They have all the skill set, but because of very firmly entrenched barriers to entrepreneurs of color, they haven't been able to get the money to do it on their own, or they haven't been able to go to the path that someone else may have. So we also see a way to also increase minority ownership of businesses, because we have them all over the place. Where it's a guy who's been doing it, being the manager for 10 years. He could do it. He just may not have access to the resources that the nonprofit can help him get access to. But the nonprofit wouldn't be the main operator of the business. You have that manager who has all the experience there. So again, it's not a perfect solution that fits everything, but when it's right, it can work really well.
Great, thanks. Tomas, I wanted to ask another question to you, actually, and this was, what is the potential for, I mean, you gave some figures about the conversion opportunity, and, I gave figures at the beginning about the extraordinary concentration of business ownership and wealth, right, among a very small percentage, Can these type of operations actually make a difference?
I believe so. Look, everybody buys food, everybody buys clothes, everybody has to have, you need services to support the places that you live, whether it's trades, whether it's administrative support, whether it's tutoring. There's a number of opportunities. We're just because a business isn't in a low-income community or a traditionally underserved community doesn't mean that community doesn't need it or isn't have that ability to support it. It just often means that the powers that be that make choices chose not to be there. So I think, but again, every community has to do a real kind of hard look at where are our opportunities. For me, for Southern California, we're the largest concentration of manufacturing in the country.
Right.
So it makes sense for us to be involved in manufacturing. If I was in Phoenix, I'd have a different approach. Maybe I'd be doing air conditioning repair or something. But it depends on, what that local community is. It's hard to put a scale to it.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of unmet market demand right now in communities, and we don't know what that is until we actually go out there and do it.
That's fair. Melissa, you want to jump in at all? What is the potential of community ownership in this? In trying to change these numbers.
Well, I think just to piggyback a little bit on what Tomas has said, the cooperatives are always filling market gaps. That's why they exist. People create a cooperative or a form of shared ownership when the market isn't serving them. Whether that's because the people in power have decided to abandon that market, or for any number of reasons. And so I think if we think about the market gaps, and those market gaps show up in the need for nonprofit organizations. So if you sort of are a nonprofit organization addressing racial equity, mapping that mission to increased minority ownership of business is like a very quick, it's an intuitive leap. So you can see that, business ownership is the second most important asset class after home ownership. If you care about people of color owning assets, you should care about people of color owning businesses. And one way to get there is through transitioning existing businesses, which are predominantly owned, I think 80% owned by white men. And the workers in those businesses are not white men. So that's an easy sort of equation. I think the hard part, obviously, is actually buying and running the business. And that's where I think so we can see the potential impact, but if running businesses were, a cakewalk, we'd all be doing it. So I think that's where the words of caution come in too. You can see the potential impact. And so for me, the two things to sort of shore that up, or help us make the leap from being able to see the impact to actually being able to make the impact, is having capital available and having business skills and expertise. You have to have those two things if you're gonna engage in social enterprise. Social enterprise is not like business light. In fact, it's like business heavy, right? Because you're trying to run a business according to values, which is harder.
Yeah, great, thanks. Mike, I thought I'd throw in a question for you. If you're, are there, since you've worked both in the restaurant world and then at DC Central Kitchen, are there specific pitfalls you would tell people to, watch out for and avoid?
Well, all of the pitfalls are the things you want to avoid in business. You're going to want to avoid in social enterprise, and I can look back at my personal experience and say probably the biggest issue that we faced as a restaurant was opening up undercapitalized, ultimately because we overspent in construction and took longer than we thought we would. So we basically spent our working capital before we had opened our doors, and that's a hole that's really hard to get out of. And that just opens up. That goes back really to the heart of the issue about access to capital. Right? Who has access to capital? And I was just reading something before before we came on here about the SBA loans. Now what's interesting is a lot of nonprofits aren't necessarily eligible for SBA loans, and that's something that's the topic I think for a different webinar, and why not? And this is a way to expand that capital into the social sector. But folks who typically or traditionally marginalized populations not having access to that capital to get into businesses in the first place. I think that's really something that we have to do. The other thing that I just want to throw out there real quick is that one of the big pitfalls that social enterprises need to avoid is we need to remember that indeed we are a social enterprise. One of the rules that I mentioned, the 8 rules, the last rule is and this is odd, and a lot of people might not dig this or agree with it, but one of the last rules is we have a moral obligation to put ourselves out of business or fail trying. And so what that means is, take our example of our school food business. We are doing food in a way that the larger international food companies typically don't, and have said they can't, because it's not good business. But it's our role to prove them wrong, to show what can be done, that ethical wages can be paid, ethical sourcing can be done, a good, healthy product can be put in the community, and a profit can be made if one chooses to do that. And one would hope that we would force others who have better resources and more infrastructure and should be able to do what we do cheaper, more effectively, more efficiently. And if they can do it with the same kind of love and dignity and care and respect that we do at a better cost, then we should step aside and say, what's next? Where's the next challenge? Where's the next thing that people say we can't do? So this is the pitfall that I think we fall into as social enterprises or nonprofits. We always want to say, businesses, we want to act more like business. In business, some people will say, you need to act, you social enterprises, you need to act more like business. Well, the truth of the matter is business sort of screwed it up in the first place, and that's what we're doing, is cleaning up the mess. Ultimately, what we want to do is get businesses to act and think more like social enterprises and nonprofits, and then we'd all be in a better place.
That sounds good. Melissa, I thought you sort of referred to this a little bit, but I thought I'd push a little bit on, how can community ownership of business effectively address the racial wealth gap? And I know that Dolly's done a fair amount of work in that area.
Yeah, well, I think the point about transitioning existing businesses and ownership of business assets, I think, is the primary one. But I think there's a piece we don't talk about a lot, which is sort of that bottom of the iceberg layer, where you're looking at businesses that are not they're not mobility engines, they're not asset builders. They're there to stabilize extremely vulnerable people in extremely crappy jobs, or people who are hustling on the side or doing income patching, and I think the racial wealth gap has is both created by and has created this frayed fabric whereby people don't have access to an employment relationship, and even if they do have access to an employment relationship, it's not one that's going to create mobility. So for me, the sort of the critical piece about cooperatives is the aggregation of human power, right? Labor power into a business entity that can stabilize people's lives. And then that's not enough. So I think there's this role for the nonprofit sector. It's an ecosystemic role, whereby nonprofits then can help leverage more capital into those social enterprises so that they become more than just stabilizers, where they can move policy that actually shifts industry norms, in ways that materially affect the lives of workers of color. So I think business alone isn't going to do it, right? Business is broken, and social enterprise alone isn't going to do it. We're going to get killed in the market if we don't take an ecosystemic approach and try and leverage everything that we have to support those businesses, and then begin to build the kind of engines that we need to address a racial wealth gap that is widening. Frankly, it's not going away.
Right. Tomas, you want to jump in at all?
Yeah, I just want to. My experience when I worked for nonprofits, there seemed to be this hesitant relationship to capital, especially to things that aren't philanthropic. And I want to put it out there that the nonprofits are already operating as businesses. You already have these skill sets that most businesses should have, and sometimes don't have, but you're already doing that. And a big part of what I'm talking about in terms of addressing the context of that is it's the same thing to you when you go fundraising. When you're pitching to a foundation or you're pitching to a funder, you want to make sure that you have the research done and that you're within what they want to see. It's the same thing with the market and then launching your business that way too. And I think for us, because of income inequality, because of the high cost of living, because of all the challenges that we face and the high barriers to entry to tech and to the other things that everybody's super excited about, we have to look at social enterprise, and we have to look at transitional ownership, and we have to look at ways to create different opportunities for people of color and from communities of color, because the ones that are right now being very popular in around the country just aren't available to us, at least not at a scale that's going to transform the communities that have been traditionally underserved. So I think the key for me is having good partners, having people who have expertise. Like Mike said, he has expertise in that space, and he's focusing it in a little different way now than he did before. But there's a number of people all over the country who have the expertise and can help direct that to make what you're doing impactful, or to help you kind of move into that role. And I think it's worth the effort. It's worth the brain damage to figure out how to make a difference there.
Great, thanks. So Mike, I'm going to ask you one quick question, and then we'll go to audience questions. But, what can philanthropy do to, support community ownership of business?
Well, I think it probably goes back to the capital idea of investing in enterprises that may not appear on the surface to be exactly what foundations typically are going to invest in. But look at more program-related investments. Look at long-term low-interest loans. Look at extending, making bigger investments in bigger businesses. I think again, long-term, if we want these larger outcomes, we're going to have to put in bigger investments up front.
Great, thanks. So Melissa, one question. Go ahead. Yeah, let's jump in.
Just jump real quick, and I'll do this real fast. I think it's already starting to move in that direction, and you have groups that, like the community development parts of the large banks, that are funding initiatives like DAWI's. We recently received a grant from the Kellogg Foundation through the Sustainable Communities Law Center to develop models that allow for nonprofits to get involved and be incubators. We call it the two-step model. Or to use their nonprofit status to do bargain sales, which are beneficial to owners and to the nonprofits as buyers. So, and then those models will be available to people who want them, because that was the intent of the funding of our program. So we're starting to see a lot more movement towards that space, and we're excited to be working on that and to share what we find.
Great. So I'll move to audience questions. Melissa, so one question was about just sort of getting an understanding of, what is the difference between an ESOP and a worker co-op? I'm sure you've heard that question a few times.
An ESOP is a federally regulated mechanism for employees to buy into a business. It's an ownership form. It falls under retirement benefit law. It's complicated. It tends to suit larger businesses better, and it has a whole ecosystem. Because it is complicated, it has a whole ecosystem of support around it. But essentially, it's a way for workers to buy into the businesses that they work for as part of a retirement savings. And it doesn't necessarily have a democratic component. There isn't any mandate for member benefit, member control, the way that there is in a formal co-op. But many ESOPs have deep programs of employee participation. And as I said, they tend to be better suited for like businesses. There's a sort of dispute in the field, but over 40, over 50, over 100 workers. So they're for large entities, and there's a cost to implementing an ESOP, and there's a really strong system of support. Worker co-ops are also sort of a form that exists in federal law and the tax code, but they really vary by state, and there is no sort of preferred standard form for a worker co-op, so they sort of are all over the map in terms of the legal forms that they take, but they are governed by this sort of three-part principles of member benefit, member ownership, and member control. So those are sort of two, they're not poles, actually. I think of it as a spectrum of options for people who work in a business to own it.
Great, thanks. Mike, an interesting question that came up was about how you did that $71 million calculation, and I think one of the components was health. So, how do you monetize the health benefits? And I'm sure
the piece that you have, Steve, that you'll share has more insight into that. And I will say that all of the numbers that we've used are third party, either academic or other government institutions. Like CDC, I think, has a cost of what it costs. Like living in a food desert has a cost. There's an amount of money that's been assigned to that. Malnutrition has a cost. So I'm not qualified to go into all of that, but I do. That is explained in greater detail in the handout that you have, and I'm happy to put anyone in touch if they want to reach me to my colleague who has worked that whole piece up.
Great, thanks. I guess there was a question, Tomas, about whether Concerned Capital works with worker co-ops in particular.
Oh, we do. Our mission and our function is saving the jobs and growing the jobs. And if it's appropriate to set up the worker co-op, absolutely. Oftentimes what we try and do is make sure that we have a compelling offer so that we can get control of the company and then figure out, how to move that forward. Because unfortunately, a lot of times the owner, if they're in a rush to liquidate or to move on, it may take too long to set up the co-op. So we find ways to kind of shortcut that. But absolutely, we very much believe in worker ownership and the democratization of that.
Great. So I guess one question that came up, and I know the answer is yes, Melissa, but people were interested in if there were any translator co-ops. So
yeah, there are quite a few actually. Yeah, there are a concentration of translation co-ops in New York. There's one in Wisconsin, one in Texas. There are I don't actually have the data right at my fingertips, but there are a handful of them across the country. And I think, that's a perfect example of a kind of a job that can be made better by joining together into a cooperative. You're essentially an independent worker as a translator or interpreter, but by coming together, you might be able to negotiate better rates. You also may be able to offer more languages, access more markets, have a sort of more formal business face for what you're doing. So yeah, those exist. I'd be happy to share that information if folks want to reach out directly.
Okay, great. Tomas, there was a question about market feasibility studies. I don't know. The question was about daycare, but I'm sure what goes into the market feasibility study work that you guys do would be a broader question.
I'll give a very high level because I don't have enough time to really break it all down. But essentially, it's establishing the need and the price point for that need. And then you have to go through an analysis where you figure out what your expenses are and can you meet that need within a price point or close to that price point, or can you subsidize your costs so that you can provide that at a price point that the people or the community you're trying to serve are going to be able to afford. As what we tend to do is we'll do projections and help the nonprofit see what the break-even point is. Because you're a nonprofit, I mean, if that's where you want to be is just breaking even, then we will tell you where that is. And if you can do better than that, then it becomes additional income that you can use for the program.
Great, thanks. So this is a question I guess anybody can jump on this one. Is sort of, what is the success rate of community ownership forms of businesses? So we know, like, for example, with private small business, it's something like 3 in 10. Do we have any data about, how well social enterprise or cooperatives do?
I have some data on worker co-ops, and it's a surprising answer. They have an enormously high success rate compared to regular businesses, but that's also because they're a lot harder to start. So if you make it past the startup phase and actually get to form the business, it's got a pretty decent chance of success. So there are huge barriers to starting a worker co-op that I think we're working on addressing. But typically, the danger point for a co-op, the danger point for a traditional business is in the first year. If it's going to fail, it's probably going to fail in the first year. The danger point for a co-op tends to be in the third year, interestingly. And if you do manage to get started, you have a decent shot at staying going, is what our data tells us.
And just to follow, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just saying, what we found is that because we work with transitioning and ongoing concerns, that you can look back and see how well they have been doing and project forward how well they could do based on operational changes and choices they make. But if you don't have responsible management, if you don't have responsible people looking for new sales and doing that sort of thing, then it's not going to work. But you know, they do have a high success rate.
Yeah, great. I was curious, Melissa, any reason why the third year is the toughest year?
It's just pure speculation on my part. I mean, I think in the case of co-ops that are incubated by nonprofit entities, they may be supported through the first couple years and then sort of hit their own in that third year. I think there's a lot of sacrifice and you know, sort of investment of time on the part of members in the startup phase, maybe, you know, and more capacity that maybe begins to wear thin in the third year if things are difficult. So I think that it's sort of like grit and will may pull it through longer. I also think co-ops, and this is not necessarily a good thing, co-ops tend to start with less capital and less access to capital than conventional businesses. So they may be more conservative in their initial approach and in their initial spending and make it longer. They don't have the option to overspend their working capital in the same way a single entrepreneur business might.
Interesting, thanks. Have a question from an audience member about sectors. So are there specific sectors or industries, or however you want to think of it, you know, where the opportunity for community ownership is particularly high? Any of you can jump in. Tomas, I think I see you wanting to jump in.
Yeah, I think that, you know, trades are good, and there's tradition there, especially because everybody needs, you know, the support of, you know, or maintenance of where they live. We also look at, like, if you're in an urban area, laundry service for the, you know, floor mats of the hotels and that sort of thing. There's a lot of things where you're looking at basic services that everybody's going to be using that are good, reasonable businesses that may not be the shiny high-tech thing, but that are just solid businesses. So I think they tend to be a little more in the service sector, but I think you can make it work we've seen it work on a number of different levels, from professional organizations that are doing advertising and that sort of thing, all the way down to guys who are making cheese. So I think it's really more about what's in your area, what does that need, and what do you have the resources to support.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, I would echo Tomas that it's place-based. You know, it's like what's the market in your area. But I think there might be a couple other ways to think about it. Like, where are there anchor markets that can be served? Where are there market gaps where people not getting a service or a product that they need that can be filled? And where can a co-op specifically add value? So in something like a labor cooperative, owning it actually increases retention and builds skills of worker owners. So it has a higher value proposition than a conventional business if it's done right. And so we see a concentration of worker co-ops in the care economy, where caring more about your job actually helps you do your job better. And in kind of third-party contracted labor or independent contractors coming together to create a co-op, because again, it adds value to have that sort of sense of ownership, and it creates a market advantage for the co-op.
Steve, just real quick, if I could just pick up on what Melissa said, that the expansion of our social enterprise has really been due to the locally sourced scratch cooked school food, and that's been a result of being able to leverage anchor institutions that exist in Washington, D.C., most notably the public school system, which in D.C. is significant, 122 schools, K through 12. And then there's colleges, there's universities, there's hospitals, there's all sorts of other opportunities around. And that is really the piece that's allowed us to continue to thrive and grow.
Yeah, and I mean, just hospitals and universities alone, you're talking about more than $1 trillion in the U.S. economy, absolutely. So it's a large amount. Yeah. Well, an interesting question came in about, that the role of nonprofits is in some sense to change values, and but how to, but this, this webinar is also about, changing who profits from the economy. So, how could anybody on this panel speak to, how do we actually, shift? Right now, a very small number of people are profiting from the economy. What are some of the mechanisms by which, these ownership models actually do shift that, the profit?
Well, again, we're not a community ownership, so Melissa and Tomas can speak more to that. But the way we do our business is the most important thing, more than what it is that we do in terms of our business. So, and that's what when I was talking about having the courage to step away when a business can come in and do what we do better. Right now, people can do it cheaper. They can probably do it faster. They can do it more efficiently, but they can't do it with the kind of dignity and respect and love that we do. And they're not going to do, and they're not doing it. They're not doing it, paying above the district's living wage and providing full health care and matches for 401ks and all the other benefits that we put in that we bake into the business that makes it the business. If we were a shareholder, profit-only driven business, we would do a lot of things differently, and we'd be doing really well. And these are some conversations that we have occasionally with our board. We would not have to worry about much if we cut our benefits or if we decided to pay minimum wage. We'd be fat and happy, but we wouldn't be DC Central Kitchen and we wouldn't be doing the business we're doing. So the business has to benefit those that are participating in it, or it's not a social business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's the core. That's the nut of it. I mean, who is this business benefiting? And cooperatives can be especially clarifying because it's written there in the in the form. This benefits the members, and there's profit sharing and all that. But I don't think every business has to be a co-op. I do think every business has to share the fruits of its labor with its workers. And so, if profit sharing becomes widely implemented, that's a win for us. If some equity stake in the business is taken up by, conventional businesses, that's a win. Changing the conversation is part of what we're doing here through these demonstration projects. I just read this article about Broadway, as a result of the success of Hamilton. Actors on Broadway are like, wait a minute, that show just made millions of dollars for someone who's not us. So they're advocating for profit sharing and some sharing of the upside on successful shows. That's huge. That's a huge high-profile industry where it's extremely intuitive. Wait, we worked really hard. It's directly because of our hard work and skill that this is now profitable. We want a piece of that. And I think the more of that we can see, the better, in whatever form it takes.
Great. Tomas, you want to jump in?
I would just add, and I could be wrong here, but the invisible hand of the economy isn't perfect. And there's looking at how businesses are making choices now, or looking how our economy is growing now. It doesn't work for everybody. It just doesn't, and it leaves out entire sections of our our country, both in rural and urban and semi-urban communities. So I think the way we change the story, or the way you start changing things, and this is at the core of Concerned Capital's mission, is we show people you can be successful in places like that you can make money in places like that. You know, I did a lot of work with new market tax credits, and I still do those kinds of things. And that was the intent of that program, is to show people, yeah, you can come here and make money. Now, unfortunately, you know, with that program, a lot of people making the money are the developers and lawyers. But that doesn't mean that it was initially a bad concept. So I think the more successful local businesses, the more people see that you can support your local community, you can do well, you can make, you know, money, you can provide jobs, you can do those sorts of things, then other people are going to come in and do it too. Unfortunately, philanthropy doesn't have enough money to do it all, to address the entire problem. You have to involve the market. So the way we involve the market is by showing them that, hey, here's a low-hanging fruit, come over with us, and show them that, you know, it can be done. And if you can bring up entrepreneurs, like I'm sure in Mike's organization, there's people watching Mike and learning. They may one day go and start their own business, but the way they do business is going to be heavily influenced from what they learn from Mike. And then we're spreading around like a starfish.
All right. Well, I think that'll be the last word, Tomas. Thank you to Mike Curtin, Melissa Hoover, Tomas Duran, also Ed Whitfield, for the interview earlier. And, please feel free to, please do support Nonprofit Quarterly, use our hashtag Rebuild the Economy, and please join us again at the next webinar in the series. Will be about community ownership of capital, and will be on Thursday, February 14th. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.